Hi, Richard.
Hey, hey, what's going on?
Figured out the tech. Woohoo!
Okay, look at you. No
Already we're at
scarf,
1,000.
no scarves. How's it going?
Good, good. But I've always loved the t-shirts that you wear. What does your t-shirt say tonight?
Uh,
I can't read it.
Injustice anywhere. Yeah, as a threat to justice everywhere. Yeah,
I love it. I'm wearing my men healing
yeah.
shirt.
Hey, okay, men healing. Yeah, all right. Actually, since you're wearing a men healing shirt, why don't you set us off and talk about how important it is for us to and invest in the work that men healing has been doing because you've been doing this work for so long. And like how long have you been doing it working with men healing?
I'm working with men healing for about 11 years now, almost 11 years.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
I've been working in the field of sexual violence for closer to 20 years and working with men for about 17 years of those.
Wow.
I think it's important to support all survivor causes. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
support men healing because I feel like, you know this too, that many men have talked about really feeling very isolated and very alone and
Mm-hmm.
looking for community, looking for something like men healing to be a
Mm-hmm.
part of, to build those connections, to break that isolation and to recognize that they're not alone. And if we don't support men healing and growing men healing, men aren't going to have that ability anymore. So I think it's really important, again, to support men healing its mission of connection, breaking isolation, and just, again, building community of male survivors.
Yes. See, I knew you could do that way better than I could. Um, because that's a big part of what this process is, and this series of IG Live are really geared towards you know bringing awareness to the issue, but also like just asking people to donate to this cause and to this work, so that we can create more spaces and more opportunities for folks to participate, for men who want to heal in community to be able to have access, because we don't want to ever deny anyone access based on not having the resources. And so the money that you donate within this like time period and even beyond the 90 days 90K goal that we have would be amazing. And we're also celebrating 90 weekends of recovery, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so this is the 90th weekend of recovery, which is the weekend in which the men come together and create that space of community, in which Sharon has been facilitating and supporting that work for 11 years. And it's nothing short of miraculous and amazing, the work that's being done, the lives that are being changed. And we also know that like the lives of men are just not their individual experiences, right? We don't heal in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
So, the lives that are impacted by the men who survive, violence and trauma, sexual violence, um, their healing will have a residual healing effect on the lives of other people around them. Um,
Said that, Richard. I just want to give a chance to plug that we're also really wanting to provide services to partners, friends, and family of survivors as well. Much like you said, that sexual violence not just impacts survivors, but everyone else around them. And recognizing that for people who witness people who've experienced trauma, such as a partner, family member, loved one, they themselves can experience trauma and may have difficulty in being able to find support for themselves and for their loved one who's a survivor. So we really want to be able to build that program. So just something else to think about. If you yourself are a partner, friend, family of a survivor, that Men Healing can really provide you services and support as well. Really recognizing that, again, those partner, friends, and family are part of that community that you had mentioned that we really need to continue to build.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so listen, if you don't donate now, I don't know what's going on. Because we need that support. And like we always say, like I've been saying, the last 7 weeks, like the money doesn't go to like any like storage place. The money goes directly to creating space for the male survivors. And just to offer the facilitators a little bit of money, to get there, to get to the destination, and for their time that they spend helping to create that space. So, Sharon, jump right in. Just go in and tell everyone like the work that you do,
Mhm.
and like why Men Healing, And why working with male survivors is something that's important to you.
So I actually work full-time at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, also known as BARC. And I know BARC has been working with men explicitly since 1998. And when I came on to BARC in about 2001, a little bit later, I took over the Men's Initiative, which was focused on working with male survivors. And the reason I got into it was really kind of by accident. But when we think about where I am in Boston, that there was the police abuse scandal. So really recognizing at that point that men needed to be supported in their experience of sexual violence. And then sort of, as you said before, the dominoes sort of fell, that people recognized that men needed services. And so those services started to come out, such as Men Healing. And like I said, I kind of fell into the work, but to be honest with you, it's what keeps me in the work is that I get to see resilience every day. People often say to me, like, how can you do this work? How do you do this work? And I'm like, it's not as hard as you think it is. It is difficult to sit with people in pain, but it's also an honor to share in that pain and hold that burden with them. But then I get to see the resiliency. I get to see people come out of the other side. I get to see the healing process. Really random, but one of my favorite moments is when we do weekends of recovery is sort of thinking about when the men come into the weekend, just how anxious everyone is, how nervous people are, their eyes are down. They seem like they have the weight of the world on their shoulders. And then at the end of the weekend, the men's chins are up. They're making eye contact. They seem a little bit lighter. That's the reason why I do this work, is to see, again, the men build that sense of community connection, to feel less alone, to be heard and to be believed. So again, I fell into it, but there's many reasons why I stay in it. And I've been lucky too that BARC, the Rape Crisis Center I work for, has done a lot of collaborative work with Men Healing as well, and been able to put on days of recovery for male survivors here in Massachusetts. And I encourage anyone who's watching who works at a Rape Crisis Center to really work with Men Healing to provide services for men. I think it's really important.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I just latched on that you said is that, it's really not that difficult. And so I'm just thinking about like the new social worker or like advocate or, even like, the family member, but more specifically the folks who are, doing the work kind of like in a professional setting and context. For some folks, it is difficult, right? For a lot of reasons. And could you talk a little bit, because there's one thing that comes to mind, but I want to hear you like kind of elaborate a little bit more on like some of the things that you've done to make it not as difficult, right? And to make it not have as much of an impact on you, and some of the ways that other folks might be experiencing now, specifically women who are working in the capacity of serving male survivors.
There's a couple of things. I think one thing I think is really important, the work that we're doing, and I'll talk about, there's a bunch of things I want to say, so I'm sorry if I just sort of go off on a bunch of random tangents. I'll announce it. That I think what's really important is really thinking about seeing men as victims or as survivors. I attended a training many moons ago, and Zoe Flowers from Women of Color Network was one of the speakers. She said something so simple yet so profound. She said survivors don't have barriers. Institutions have barriers, systems have barriers, and we as providers have barriers. And it's those barriers that don't allow men to come to us. We often ask, why didn't a man disclose? It's more about, what is it about us as providers that doesn't allow for them to disclose? Right? One of the most important things we need to do is to check our own bias. And I think a lot of us have an idea of what a rape survivor looks like. And that's not at all what the rape survivor looks like. They look like anybody and everybody. And so I think it's really important that we really check our bias and really recognize that anyone can experience sexual violence, and that if a man is coming to you, you be really thoughtful about your initial reaction to their disclosure. I could tell you a million stories of men who disclosed and the reactions that they got and how it shut them down. So that is not helpful. So your initial response, their disclosure, has a huge impact on their healing process. So I just think it's important to check those things. And then thinking about being a woman and doing therapy and working with men. I'll share a little story with you. One of my colleagues, Ernesto from Men Healing, and I were at a conference and for mental health professionals. And we were doing it on working with men survivors, and someone in the back, I don't remember exactly the words, but the gist was, well, I'm a woman and I'm a therapist. I don't know why the man won't tell me. And it said out loud, have you ever thought that you could represent the perpetrator? And it was like that took the air out of the room. So I just think it's also really important for us, I'm talking for myself as a cisgender woman, that it's really thoughtful. It's really important to be thoughtful about the identities you're bringing in, particularly around gender. Other identities are also important. It's important to really talk about those. But in this moment, I want to focus on gender and really thinking about that if men can be survivors, that women can also be perpetrators. And I think that as a mental health professional who is a woman, I have to be really thoughtful of all the roles that I can represent in that therapeutic space. Therapy can be really reparative or it can be repetitive. And if we are honest about what we're bringing into the space and we're honest about the roles we're playing when it comes to working with male survivors, like I said, we could be the perpetrator, we could be the mother, unfortunately, that neglected their child or even sacrificed their child, or the girlfriend that have sexually abused them, or the babysitter. And I think it's important for us to recognize that and to be really explicit in talking about gender dynamics in the counseling and working with a man so that we can really identify those roles. So like I said, it can be reparative because sexual violence really disrupts relationships to self, to others, the world. And there can be really reparative in rebuilding those relationships through the relationship between myself, like a therapist, and working with a male survivor. We as therapists are really thoughtful about talking about those things like gender dynamics that are coming into the room, talking about the idea that we can represent or trigger someone to the perpetrator. I think it's really important to bring those things into the room. If we don't, and we ignore those gender dynamics, we aren't thoughtful about those things, we can repeat some of those abusive relationships, and that is not at all helpful. So I know I just sort of put a lot out there, but I'm so interested in thinking about me being a woman working with men survivors and how important it is to talk about those things. Because Richard Gardner in his book talks about, wrote a book, Betrayed as Boys, and he talks about a lot of survivors will seek out therapists that match the gender of their abuser to do some of that work and work it out. And it's important for us to be thoughtful about that. And now I realize I don't think I answered your question. I think you were asking about self-care.
No. You answered it all, and you just like opened up so many things that I'm like really grateful for you doing. Like, I mean, the first thing that came to my mind is when you were talking about we might represent the identity of the perpetrator or the bystander, right? Like I've met so many men who have, resentment towards moms because they allowed the person who caused the harm to do so, or they didn't intervene, right? And so they harbor a lot of resentment towards mom. The other thing I'm thinking about
in the therapy, I could play that, like you said, in the therapy space,
right? And so you show up thinking like the person who you told the story about, saying like, "Hey, I'm a woman. Why doesn't he feel comfortable talking to me?" Because, right? And then we know it's very complex, right? So this is not to cast aspersions on the mom, because mom might have heard it, and the things that we do as parents, like, is like we internalize it as an extension of ourselves and like our failures to not protect our children. And so all types of stuff happens internally that doesn't allow for us to respond in a way that will make a person, our child, feel comfortable disclosing further. And so it's so interesting because one of the things I always say to like, anyone who's being, and Deb said this as well, it's just like the best thing you could do is just be quiet and listen, right? And then see where it goes, as opposed to like trying to come in. Because the other thing is that a woman therapist might be a survivor herself and might harbor experiences of harm that was caused by men that influences our interaction. So it's like a constant checking in, wouldn't you say?
It is absolutely a constant checking in. We're both like myself as a therapist and the survivors or clients I'm working with, we're bringing in multiple identities. We're bringing in our context of life. Nothing is done in a vacuum, right? And so we have to, like you said, be open to listening and opening to having conversations about those identities and about what we're bringing into the space.
Yeah. You kind of went mute a little bit, but we'll bring it back. There you go.
I apologize for that. I was just saying it's really just important, I think, to be transparent about everything that's in the space. And I think our job as therapists to have those difficult conversations, particularly around identity or things that might be uncomfortable, to allow space for those conversations.
Yeah. So, I mean, talk about a time, like, so how did you come to this conclusion? Did it just come naturally to you? Was it something that you experienced? Were you just like in tune?
No, not necessarily. I think,
Uh-huh.
you know, I wasn't necessarily taught, even when I got to work around working with men, I wasn't really taught a lot about what it was to be a woman in this work and what it is to be a white woman in this work. And I think one thing that really changed it for me, I had a client of mine that came in, and he was an older gentleman, a larger gentleman. I'm only 5'3", but it was interesting to have him come into the space, in the counseling space, and he was so small. And I remember him saying a few things to me. And I remember him, like, he could barely look me in the eye. And when he did, he said, it's like looking in the eyes of a snake. And I was sort of thrown. And then I realized, as he talked about his history, what he meant. He was abused by women. I had, again, didn't really think about it, didn't even take into account. So I think, like you said, it's really important to listen to the men that we're working with, or all survivors that we're working with, to see where they're coming from. And his other question was, are you going to hurt me? And I remember, and I still get like teared up when I think about it, like, I'm not here to do that, but how would I think he's going to trust me if other women in his life have hurt him? So I had to be really honest with myself and say, I don't know if I'm going to hurt you. That's not my goal, but I don't know necessarily if that's going to happen here. I can't promise that I won't, but I'm going to try not to. But I think that moment really stuck with me. And that moment really made me think about my work as a woman in this field. And as you know, Deb and Uma were on, and again, amazing women therapists and working with men. But I remember a few years ago, Lisa and Sandy, also from Men Healing, and I had a lot of thought partnership around thinking about women in this work. And just, it was really powerful to really sit and think about that, and think about sort of our place in these weekends. And half the population might identify as a woman. And so really thinking about how can we help these men to also have relationships with women. And that's, again, a really important piece of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, wow. You're just making me think. I have a colleague who tells a story about one of the therapists, and one of the people that she was working with, a man, he tried to tried to breach her boundaries. And he did it kind of casually, and it was like kind of flirtatious. And she had to firmly establish her boundaries, in a loving way, in a compassionate way, but like, hey, this is not that. And what she found out is that this person, who was also a survivor of sexual abuse, the harm was caused by women, had every therapist that this person has worked with, they've had some type of sexual relationship with them. Yeah. And so it goes back to your point about like therapy can be reparative, it could be harmful, right? And we also know that like when you're experiencing sexual harm, the objectification of your body, and I know this on a personal level, right, kind of leads to like further engaging behaviors where you allow your body to be objectified, right? You think that your body is your value. You think your body is what you have to offer to these relationships. Right. And so, the fact that she brought that up, and she was able to identify that and establish boundaries in a way that really built trust. Right. Because beneath that was whether he was conscious of it or not. And the thing, when I heard that story, it made me think about growing up as a young person, and myself and so many of the men, the boys that I was growing up with, had experiences where the older women, a lot of times their mother's friends, their older sister's friends, engaged in sexual behavior with them, sexually violated them. And, in that moment, at that time, we looked at it like it was okay, right? We kind of bragged about it, but it was really sexual harm, right? Yeah. And it compromised our sexual identity. It objectified us. It made us, really stuck in our bodies in ways that we didn't even start to think about. We still don't talk about that, the harm that is caused by women who sexually abuse men.
I get very upset often when I read the newspaper and how reporters talk about those experiences of older women and younger men, how it's always a relationship or an affair. Look at the script, and it was an older male, like a teacher, and a younger female, is that we would call that rape. So we need to be thoughtful about how we're talking about it, that I think men are sexualized. are taught to be sexualized. And so when they don't recognize what was done to them as sexual violence. And then you have people on the outside being like, yeah, good for you. But on the inside, like, this is not okay. And those are the men that I see now, right, as adults, that were taught that they were sort of hypersexual. They taught that they were lucky that an older woman was into them. You're reading the newspaper, it's about a relationship or an affair. And if this boy or young man is not feeling like this is not okay, there's really nowhere to go and nowhere to talk about it. So like you said, they sit with it and it impacts their whole life, their sexuality, their gender identity, all of these other things. And it has a huge lifelong impact. And I think there's a couple of things, like in order to identify men as victims, we have to also see that women can be perpetrators. And both of those things I think are really hard for people to navigate. Because when you think about stereotypes of women, they're supposed to be nurturing. When you think of stereotypes of men, they're supposed to be protectors. If the protectors are being hurt and the nurturers are doing the hurting, how do we feel safe? But for us to not acknowledge who is really perpetrating sexual violence actually perpetuates sexual violence. Because we're letting, honestly, people get away with it, because we're identifying and seeing men as being victims and like women or anyone as being perpetrators. So we really need to change that about our culture when we talk about rape culture, that really allows space for people to identify what was done to them as being sexual violence and giving them the space to really talk about it, acknowledge it. And we need to hold perpetrators accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. You're hitting it on all points. And you know, one thing I'll add too, and then if you take into consideration the context of race, right, and racism and white supremacy and narratives that have been, you know, perpetuated about, you know, Black sexuality and the hypersexuality of Black men, right, and we also know about the adultification of Black boys that are, like, you know, seen as 8 years older than they are as children, right, and so like these narratives also influence and reinforce. And more importantly, like, you know, causes a disproportionate, you know, accounts of Black boys being perceived as hypersexual and therefore being, you know, harmed in a sexual way by adult women. And you know, I lived that, and I didn't understand its impact, you know, but the other thing about it is, like, that was something that I could talk more about freely than my experience of sexual abuse that came as a result of a man, right, who caused harm, who to me, you know, it was like I kind of bragged about it, but it was still having the same effect. It was just exacerbated. It was just all of it, all of it, you know. And so, yeah, and then if you think about the fact that so many therapists are women, right? So many therapists are women. So, you know, I mean, we talked before about like the importance of boundaries, things that you've done in the past and that you do today to kind of like really create that, you know, that safe space, that brave space for the men you work with. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I, again, want to just share another story that I had an experience where I've had a few experiences, but one I can think of in particular where I had a men's survivor that I was working with violate my boundaries and touched me. And I remember being so upset about it, but having to be really thoughtful about not wanting to shame this person who's already walking around with a lot of shame. So really thinking about how to have a conversation. And so I would say for any therapist, I think it's always important to have thought partnership with other colleagues, with other therapists to talk things out. But what I realized, and it actually talks to a lot of what you were talking about, Richard, is that this person was abused as a child and was never taught that they had boundaries. Why would they think I had boundaries? So I do think a lot of times when working with survivors, it's really being thoughtful about going back to some of those basic ideas. I think a lot of times we throw around things like the term boundaries, but how much time do we really spend talking about what boundaries are? And about how survivors understand what boundaries are. And a lot of times they not understand what they are, but they understand. So really actually working with survivors to really help them understand for themselves, empowering them to understand what boundaries are for themselves. That's boundaries internally, boundaries externally. These are physical boundaries, they're emotional boundaries, and helping them recognize it's that space that is about them and their needs. So helping them to create that space. There's many tools to use, but I think it's getting back to the basics and talking about what boundaries are. I think we assume a lot and we make a lot of assumptions. And in all honesty, these are people who've had their boundaries violated. How can we
Yeah.
possibly think that they even know what those are, particularly if they were abused at a young age? It comes along the intersection of race or ability or anything else, really being those things apart, and talk about the idea of why they might not lack boundaries. That's not what I mean, but they weren't taught boundaries, how and what they are, and then teaching them to think about what do boundaries look like for them and how can we help them to set those boundaries so that they're met.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's absolutely accurate. Like, I mean, the violation it's a violation, it's a breach of the boundaries, right?
Yes.
And the whole grooming process is like a breach of all of your boundaries, right? The emotional, like the mental, manipulation and, coercion, and even the threats and the fear, and then like the ultimate physical, the condition, right? All of your boundaries have been violated and breached in a very harmful way. And so that's a really, really important point that you're making, to think about that. And even like to the extent that, you might think of folks who have boundaries, like you think of folks who have boundaries as not caring about you, right? Right? Like, so a person who establishes boundaries, they don't like me, because some of that stuff becomes internalized as, okay, you don't really care about me unless you interact with me in this way, unless there's this sexual piece in this way. And that's something that I personally have dealt with and struggled with, as a man, right? And then learning that when someone establishes boundaries, it doesn't mean that they love you. It actually means that they respect you, they respect themselves. And there's a level of consistency that comes with that. Whereas as an experience of the harm makes it disrupts all consistency and like structure and barriers and boundaries in a ways that we don't even know what it looks like.
And you're talking about like just simple things that a way to model, and like you said, boundaries are about respect, and that we recognize that, again, sitting with survivors, that their boundaries have been crossed, and I have to be respectful of them by setting them. And then, but not only just setting the boundaries, but also following up and maintaining those boundaries.
Yeah.
Like you said, consistency is really, transparency and consistency are really important about what those boundaries are. And like you said, like it's really important, particularly as me as a therapist, to think about sticking to what those boundaries are. Something as simple as starting and ending sessions on time, right? That consistency, it's building that trust, it's building those boundaries. And like you said, it's about respect and about not infantilizing survivors either. Because I think sometimes to cross those boundaries or make promises you can't keep or do things that are out of sort of the therapeutic realm, I think can cause harm, because I think it also infantilizes survivors. And again, that lack of consistency, I think, can also be harmful.
Absolutely. And then you take into consideration too that a lot of folks who are therapists who do this work have experienced harm themselves. So they have a challenge. And that's not something you get in social work school or in a mental health counseling program. They may talk about it, but the process of developing it for yourself is not one that comes up in conversation. A practice of how do you, incorporate boundaries in your life as someone who's experienced harm, is not something that's covered, right? And during your internship.
I mean, they try, right? Like it's, there's, if you've heard these terms, like there's transference and countertransference. That the transference is what the clients might be putting on us, but there's countertransference is what we're putting in the room or putting on. So we do talk about that, but you're right. I don't think we talk enough about if we have our own experiences of trauma, how do we sort of keep that in check or recognize that when it's coming up for us so that we can sort of put it to the side for that moment and focus on what's going on in front of us and work with this, the survivor themselves. And then thinking about making sure that we take care of ourselves also. You talked about boundaries, and Brene Brown always says that boundaries keep us out of resentment. So we therapists, like you said, have to keep boundaries with the clients, but also with ourselves, also around sort of our outside lives. Because if we don't maintain boundaries and do what we need to do to take care of ourselves, it's not going to allow us to help the people that we're working with. And we'll become very resentful of that. But that's up to us to maintain those boundaries.
That's right. Because if you don't start it that way, right, and then it gets out of hand, then you want to come in with force to like enforce it in a way that is harsh and it's rooted in resentment, right? Like, wow. I wish we had way more time to talk about this.
Because I always think it's better to set boundaries and maybe even tougher boundaries in the beginning because you can loosen up, but it's really hard to tighten them up once there's no boundaries, right? So it's just something to be really thoughtful about relationship building is setting boundaries. And then as you build a relationship, those boundaries can be changed. They can be flexible, and that's wonderful. But it's important, like you said, to be transparent and set those boundaries from the beginning. But I'll stop talking, Richard.
No, this is your opportunity to talk, and you're doing a great job in sharing so much wisdom and insight. And I'm sure that folks are going to be listening to this and be able to benefit from the wealth of information and experience that you bring to the table.
Well, I appreciate doing these series. I really do. I love that you are giving the facilitators and men healing a chance to really talk about the work we're doing and to really focus on breaking that silence and isolation of men survivors. So thank you so much for doing this.
Yes, thank you. And I'm so grateful for all the facilitators and folks with Men Healing for just sharing it with the world, because the world needs to know. With that, it's 7:30. Are there any last words you want to leave to people? Anything else? Or
the thing I always want to say is believe survivors. I think that's important. I think in order to change rape culture and to allow space for all survivors, including men, to talk about their experiences, we need to believe them.
Yes, and I second that. And thank you. Thank everyone who chimed in. Again, this video, for those who don't have IG, if you have friends who want to get access